Evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is Mike Watson. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. I appreciate all of you coming out to on a busy evening to this debate about the Iran conflict. So for those of you who have not yet been introduced to the Alexander Hamilton Society, we're a professional network that, among other things, puts on debates both here in DC, but then also on 80 college campuses around the country about some of the most pressing issues facing our country, particular topics related to foreign policy and national security. So we're very excited to partner with the Washington Post for this event because there's been a lot of conversation about the Iran conflict, and we thought that it would be really helpful to clarify people's thinking by having a roughly hour-long substantial conversation about this particular conflict. So thanks all for coming out. I'm going to quickly introduce our moderator, Adam O'Neill, and then I'll pass it off to him and the debaters for the rest of the evening. So Adam O'Neill is the opinion editor at the Washington Post. Previous to this, he was the Washington correspondent at The Economist, and before that, he was an executive director, or the executive editor at the Dispatch, and has been an editorial page writer at the Wall Street Journal, among other things. I believe he also at one point ran a radio station in Burbank.
I was a junior 19-year-old producer at a radio station in Burbank, but
so we go deep at AHS. But we're very glad to have Adam and our debaters here. So I'll kick it over to Adam.
Thanks, Mike. Very excited to be here and to be hosting an important debate on this important issue. As we all know, Operation Epic Fury was launched on February 28th alongside Israel's Operation Roaring Lion. Over 40 days, U.S. forces conducted some 13,000 strikes, damaging Iran's Air Force, Navy, and Defense Industrial Base, including its ballistic missile capabilities and drone production facilities. The initial waves of the operation also resulted in the death of the country's supreme leader and other high-ranking officials, while Iran retaliated with regional missile barrages and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. A ceasefire took effect on April 8th. However, as of today, both sides remain at an impasse. High-level talks in Islamabad fell apart over the weekend, and President Trump has announced that the U.S. would also enact its own blockade over the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, there appears to be some willingness on both sides to continue to speak. And today, we're here to debate where we stand in the conflict, and the exact terms of the debate are resolved. The campaign against Iran is a net benefit for America's national security. Carrie Filipetti and Rebeccah Heinrichs are in favor of the resolution. Carrie is the executive director of the Vandenberg Coalition and a Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow. She previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Cuba and Venezuela and the Deputy Special Representative for Venezuela. Rebeccah is a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and the Director of its Keystone Defense Initiative. She has served as a commissioner on a number of government advisory boards, including the Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission. To my left are Jason Willick and Chris Chivvis. Jason writes a weekly column at the Washington Post on legal issues, political ideas, and foreign affairs. Previously, he was an editorial writer and editor at the Wall Street Journal, and before that, he was a staff writer and associate editor at the American Interest. Chris is a senior fellow and director of the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He previously served as the U.S. National Intelligence Officer for Europe and was the deputy head of the Rand Corporation's International Security Program. We'll begin with 5-minute statements from each debater, and then we can go into a general discussion. And if all goes well, you won't be hearing much more from me for the next hour, and we'll let the much more informed and intelligent people take up your time now that I'm done. So, Carrie, why don't we start with you? You've got 5 minutes.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for showing up, and to the Alexander Hamilton Society for hosting this event. The one quibble that I have with what Mike said is that there has not been a lot of conversation, I think, about what's going on in Iran. There's been a lot of people talking, but not so much talking to each other. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my perspectives about what's going on, and hopefully add a little bit of nuance to the conversation. So as I read the resolution, the question is not whether the operation is without cost, but whether, taking into consideration what those costs are, the operation still provides a net benefit to U.S. security. And the reason why I land on the yes side here is because I take a look at what the significant threats that Iran posed prior to these operations were and what the threat looks like today. And when you look at Iran's ability to project its power outside of its borders, which to me is the central reason why we engaged in this, we see that as it relates to its four main areas of power projection, that's their proxies, their nuclear program, their ballistic missile program, most especially, as well as their economic coercion, we are starting to make significant inroads, if not already ended those risks. So I'll go through the analysis of each of those four. To start out, I'll just very quickly run through proxies, because I think actually the proxies after October 7th have been taken out over a series of different operations. This was what actually enabled us to directly target the Iranian regime, as opposed to just focusing on its proxies, which were largely protecting its nuclear resources up until they were taken out. On the nuclear side, there seems to be a bit of confusion where people say, well, I don't understand. If Midnight Hammer was such a success, then why is it that we had to do Epic Fury? And I actually don't see a conflict between those two things. I do think that based on the assessments of the Midnight Hammer operation, that ultimately we did do significant things to detract from their military capabilities on the nuclear side. So we know that we took out the vast majority of their centrifuges. We know that we took out some of their nuclear scientists that have the ability to continue these operations if they were to restart. We know that we ended a lot of their production along all lines of the chain, whether it's enrichment, whether it's creating the uranium metal cores. All of those things we know were significantly damaged by this operation. So then why do I say we needed Epic Fury? The reason is because if you go back to President Trump's first administration, which I served in, he was always talking about how the JCPOA was a bad deal because it did not address both the nuclear side and the ballistic missile side. And you can understand why. A nuclear weapon is two things. It's the nuclear warhead, of course. It is also the delivery mechanism. And this is what brings us to the ballistic missiles program, which is why I am most convinced that this operation has been a net benefit for U.S. national security. Ultimately, what we want to do is prevent Iran from becoming North Korea. What do I mean by that? North Korea has nearly 50 nuclear weapons, and we don't do that much about it. Why? Because they have the conventional military capability to deter us from doing that. They know that if we were to try to stop them, we would be worried about them attacking South Korea or addressing us in other ways. So developing that conventional military deterrent is something that we need to make sure we do not allow Iran to do. If they have military or economic coercion over the United States, then we are not a fully sovereign country because we will be dependent on them allowing us to do certain activities. So taking out their ballistic missile capability was incredibly important. Before Epic Fury, what did they have? They had about 6,000 ballistic missiles. They had the ability, they were trying to produce over 100 ballistic missiles anew every month. And they were lying about those capabilities, saying that they were limiting them to 2,000 kilometers, when in reality, we know from the recent attempted attack on Diego Garcia that in fact they were producing capabilities that could reach twice that, meaning they could directly target not only our bases, but they could target Poland, Estonia, Greece, Italy, so many of our allies in the region. And what were we able to do as a result? Well, thanks to Epic Fury, we've hit over 13,000 military targets. That includes 80% of Iran's air defense systems, 450 ballistic missile storage facilities, 800 one-way drone storage facilities, 90% of their navy, 90% of their weapons factories, 70% of their missile launchers, and 2/3 of their arm manufacturing capabilities. This also includes 80% of their missile production facilities. So when you look at all of those components, you can see that we have prevented them from becoming a North Korea, which would enable them to, if we're worried about their control of the Strait now, and I know I'm running out of time, so I won't get to that part of it, but it can be part of the discussion. If we're worried about that now, after we've addressed their missile threat, how much more coercion could they exercise if they had hundreds of thousands of drones and tens of thousands of missiles that we were not able to stop? So I will end it there, but those are the key reasons why I think even with some of the costs that we've incurred, ultimately this is a net benefit for U.S. national security.
Thanks, Carrie. Jason, you have 5 minutes.
So my beginning assumption is that President Trump is right, that peace through strength is the best strategy. That's what he's talked about for 10 years since he's been in the political arena. And what I read him as saying is, we don't need to go to war to ensure our security. We can have peace by being strong. In other words, we can have deterrence. In my view, deterrence was actually working. Iran had not closed the Strait of Hormuz. Iran had not developed a nuclear weapon, or as far as we know, rushed to develop one. Iran was substantially weakened compared to what it was before October 7th. We had Israel pummel it in the 12-day war in June 2025. Its proxies were pummeled. Hezbollah was beaten back so badly that the regime in Syria ended up collapsing. Hamas was weakened. Israel even hit the Houthis. So the United States was able to play a role, intervening in the 12-day war with weapons that only we had to set back the nuclear program. But Israel did a lot of the work in really changing the balance of power in the Middle East in favor of itself and the Gulf states and against Iran and its proxies. So what we did, in my view, is sort of push our luck and go for kind of a solving a problem, when I think in foreign policy, you're much more likely to get what you want if you try to manage problems, manage threats, and understand that they always are going to exist. But Israel, I think, understandably, in their post-October 7th mindset, decided we can't live with this threat originating and propagating from Tehran anymore, and we have to try to eliminate it. But that, to me, is a risky proposition, especially once you've already boxed Iran in to such a great extent. The benefit to national security that we're measuring is relative to the pre-war status quo, which already had Iran significantly weakened. The attack that we perpetrated on Iran was maximally escalatory. This was not a mowing the lawn operation. This was an attempt to annihilate the government. It was a regime change operation, and now the administration is backing off from that. But there's no question that when the president says, rise up, we're killing dozens of your senior political and military officials, that's what the objective is, at least at the beginning. And so we escalated, and if the regime didn't change, once you've tried to change the regime, you have initiated an open-ended conflict. You may be able to stop and say, well, we've done a lot of the damage that Carrie described, but you've made the regime understand that there was an attempt on its life, and it's going to do everything that it can to survive, including, I would argue, increasing its incentive to create a nuclear weapon, which had not yet been created. Carrie mentioned also about our sovereignty, Iran having an ability to deter us, and if they're able to deter us, we are less than fully sovereign. I see our interests a little bit differently in the world. I think our basic interest is, as Spikeman and Mackinder and sort of the realist theorists of American foreign policy have said, to prevent any one power from dominating Eurasia. Iran was not even dominating the Middle East. It was on the run in the Middle East. So I think that our national security interests, from a traditional realist perspective, were being upheld as Iran was contained, and it couldn't, it has some ability to project power. It still will have some ability to project power after this. I don't think it's in America's interest to ensure that countries, even our rivals, have no ability to project power. There's going to be a lot of countries that have that ability, and we're still going to be sovereign, and we're going to be able to deal with it, hopefully through deterrence. But the deterrence equation that was holding for a while, where Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon, it doesn't close the Strait of Hormuz, and because it understands what the consequences might be if it made moves in those directions, we just flipped over the table on that. Now the deterrence incentives have changed. The last thing I'd say, because I also cover domestic politics, is you go to war, with the country that you have and with the understanding of the politics and the willingness of the people of your democratic country to go to war. There's no guarantee that a president is going to be willing to do this again. So once we've made the Iranian regime understand that we may destroy it, but we've launched an unpopular war, and judging by the trajectory of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, there's no guarantee. That might work, this lawn mowing approach to continually prevent Iran from having power projection ability. That might work if that was a consensus in American national security. It's obviously not a consensus. I think a future president is going to be much more reluctant to do that. So I fear that we've done is kick the hornet's nest and then into an uncertain political future in the United States, where by the way, we can withdraw. We have an ocean between us and Iran, but Israel is going to be stuck there and may not get the same kind of support that it got this time. All right.
Great. Can I open that when someone's not speaking? With that, Rebeccah.
Well, thank you all for being here. I'm just going to start by answering just a few of the things that you had just said. First of all, I think on the politics side, I think that the American people are going to support this war and be happy with this war if we win it. So I think that if you kind of look at the polling going up and down, I think it's going to be a lot of right now we're being completely saturated and inundated with negative reporting of some of the loose ends of this war, some things that are still not coming together for the United States. And that has really been what has been communicated to the American people. And so I think that you will see a rallying behind the president's efforts once he can successfully convince the American people that this has been in their favor. So I just want to I think that that's really important, but I think that that's still to be determined. Other things, I just want to foot stomp the original goals of the war. Again, it's the nuclear program, the ballistic missiles. I'm going to talk about that. Carrie kicked us off really well on that. The proxies, and then of course, all of those things had the ability to coerce the United States on the economic front. So all of those three things flowed into Iran's ability to coerce the United States. Iran had the ability to coerce the United States before the war, even after, I agree, after Midnight Hammer, after what Israel did, the Iranians were significantly weakened and diminished. And I think what we are used to hearing from our political leaders is, look, unless there is an imminent threat that you don't really have a sound pretext for further military engagement. I think President Trump actually sees it almost backwards, which is that we've weakened them and they have not been chastened. Why would we wait until they're significantly stronger again? And we know after Midnight Hammer that the Chinese got back to helping the Iranians sort of rebuild some of their air defenses and component parts. We could see the Iranians rush to ballistic missile capabilities, which if you have that conventional deterrent, it makes it much more difficult to go back and redestroy or re-entomb some of their nuclear program that they began to reconstitute. So rather than wait until it was harder, increasing the risk to U.S. forces should we have to re-engage another military operation, President Trump decided that actually now was the lowest risk opportunity for the greatest potential gain for U.S. security. The other thing, I actually disagree with this idea that the goal was to permanently solve this problem. I would agree that that would be an idealist notion that makes it sort of out of reach. I think what the U.S. was trying to do was make a partially solved problem even further solved for the near and medium term, to leave the next administration with a much easier file on the Middle East and Iran than what President Trump inherited. The other things I just want to think that are really important, because we saw, in the first 100 days, I think, or is it hours, Sammy's here. In the first 100 hours of Epic Fury, you saw basically a 90% decrease in Iran's ability to their tempo of missile firing. So significantly diminished their capacity to coerce the United States outside their borders, which is meaningful. Doesn't mean that they cannot still terrorize the Strait, but they could always terrorize the Strait. But we significantly diminished their ability to really hold at risk significant naval forces in the region, which is why the United States is now sequencing our ability to now open the Strait. I think this notion that the United States was not prepared for the Iranians to threaten the Strait is completely not supported by the evidence. Or if you've been doing national security in this town, you know that any kind of wargaming exercise you do, any kind of exercise about a potential military operation, preemptive or otherwise, against Iran would immediately result in the Iranians closing the Strait of Hormuz. And the question is, can the United States diminish their forces so they cannot credibly threaten naval forces through the Strait? And if you have a determined, international force, I think is the most helpful, which I think is being worked on behind the scenes with the Europeans, you make it much more difficult for the Iranians to actually close the Strait, not in a de facto sense, sort of by RPGs or whatever they have right now along the coast. And so I think just by significantly diminishing Iran's capabilities,
further entombing their nuclear capabilities, and then the biggest one on their ballistic missile front, destroying their ability to reconstitute. The second wave in the military campaign of Epic Fury was really focused on these underground facilities, tunnels where the Iranians were producing their missiles. If you take those out and you take out their most competent leadership and you take out their nuclear scientists, you have significantly delayed Iran's ability to credibly coerce the United States of America, especially if, my last point, if you have the United States really getting the Arab states on side, which that we can talk about too, is going to be, I think, one of the lasting political outcomes, at least in the short and medium term, that's going to make the Middle East a lot safer.
Great. I'll throw it to Chris, and we'll then go into a general discussion.
Thanks so much. Really interesting so far. I'm going to just focus, as others have, on the fact that what we're debating here is not whether or not the operation has provided any benefit to the United States. That's quite clear, and we've heard arguments to that case. But whether or not on net, American national security is better after this war. And I'm going to give you a number of reasons why that is manifestly not the case. I think, let me start, though, just briefly by acknowledging some of the gains that we've had from this operation. Clearly, the destruction of Iran's military infrastructure, attacks on its command and control, these are all good things for the United States, and I just want to state that plainly. Of course, Iran's nuclear capability was already pretty badly damaged beforehand, so the benefit is somewhat marginal, and both its nuclear and its conventional capabilities will be rebuilt over time. We don't know how long it's going to take, but it's definitely going to be coming back. Meanwhile, in the process, the regime change that the United States planned to carry out clearly failed. And so what does this do? It demonstrates to the whole world that the United States is impotent, that its military power is not as great as we all think it is. And at the same time, we've given Iran the ability to weaponize the Strait of Hormuz. Clearly, this is something that a lot of people knew theoretically to be the case, but now they've demonstrated they can actually hold the world economy hostage. This is another blow to American national security. But I think if you really want to understand where the damage has been done, you got to zoom out from the Middle East. You got to think about the broader military, economic, and geopolitical costs of this war. On the military side, consider, for example, the expenditure of munitions, which has been extraordinary because of all of the strikes that we've carried out. We've had to pull PAC-3 missiles out of Europe, weakening the defense of our allies in NATO and weakening Ukraine. In the Indo-Pacific, we've had to withdraw not only THAAD interceptors, which defend the South Koreans, but also JASSM-ER. And I'm sure many of you know what JASSM-ER are, but these are the air-launched cruise missiles, which are so essential to defeating a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Those have been sucked out of the Indo-Pacific in order to fight this war, clearly demonstrating to President Xi that we care more about the Middle East than we do about Taiwan. At the same time, I'm sure all of you have seen the news about the economic and financial costs. I mean, this war is costing billions of dollars a day to the American taxpayer, probably up to about 50 billion now, and who knows how high that figure is going to go. We all saw that the president has requested a $200 billion supplemental to fight this war. That's a huge sum of money, about 4 times the State Department's annual budget, just to put it in perspective. Economically, the IMF just reported today, what did they say? I have it written right here. The global outlook has abruptly darkened as a consequence of this war. And as you all know, of course, Americans are paying higher and higher prices at the gas pump. But to me, what matters most is actually the geopolitical impact of this war. It's the fact that it is strengthening our adversaries and weakening our relationship with our allies. I mean, think about the boon that this war is just to Russia. I mean, the fact that oil prices have gone up so high and that we've been forced to lift the sanctions that we had imposed, or at least some of the sanctions that we had imposed on Russia prior to the war, has just filled, money has just been rushing into Putin's coffers. This is an enormous boon to President Putin, and obviously a terrible thing for Ukraine. Think about it also from China's perspective. China's image as a projector of peace and stability in the world, at least when compared with the United States, is enormously reinforced. And I think you see this in recent surveys that we've seen of different populations around the world. For example, there was an Ipsos survey that was just released within the last 24 hours showing 82% of Japanese think this is a bad idea, 77% of Indians, and 65% of people in the UK. Now, the fact of the matter is that even as we are strengthening our adversaries, we obviously are creating an enormous crisis within NATO. I'll just give you, there are plenty of examples, but I'll give you two. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez of Spain has been meeting with President Xi and making joint statements critical of the war today. The Prime Minister of the UK, America's closest ally in Europe, has compared President Trump's war to Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. That is a real moment when the UK says something like that. So in any event, these are all things which are terrible for the long-term security of the United States. And when you put them alongside the marginal gains that we've talked about so far, for me at least, there's really no comparison. At the end of the day, this is clearly a net loss to American security.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a good place for us to start. And maybe I could give it back to you two, is when you look at the net effect on our relationship with our adversaries, and I know there's a lot of opacity in the Russian and Chinese regimes and how they may be perceiving this, but also with our allies and how that's affected, that's obviously we have dozens of countries that are treaty allies, but how do you all think about when analyzing the war, if I think probably all five of us agree that Iran is not the greatest threat to America, which is not to say it's not a threat, but however you want to rank it, how do you all think about the effects of this war beyond the Middle East and how it's affected our relationships in East Asia and in Europe?
I could maybe jump in first and then Rebeccah. So first of all, this is just my own personal hobby horse. I mean, Pedro Sanchez has been against U.S. Interests and policy for a very, very long time, including in 2019 when he welcomed, despite EU and U.S. sanctions, Delcy Rodriguez to land in his country. So he is not the sort of exemplar of somebody who has changed his mind on the United States. He's always been somewhat antagonistic towards us. As it relates to Chris's point about impotence, this is something that really matters a lot to me as somebody who works a lot on trying to ensure that the United States is adequately resourced to stand up to our adversaries. And one of the things that I think about is if you ask everyday Americans what their view of the military is, I mean, maybe if you ask Japanese people, they'll give you a different answer, but if you ask Americans, they are looking at absolute resolve, taking Nicolas Maduro from his bed and bringing him to justice in the United States. They're looking at Midnight Hammer, where we conducted an operation that nobody thought we had the capability to do. They're looking at the rescue of our airmen in hostile territory. And I think it's really reawakening the sense of precisely the opposite, that we actually do have incredible military capabilities. We did a poll at the Vandenberg Coalition that showed that actually Americans are very much inspired by our military capabilities. So I don't think that there is anybody who's looking at this and saying, oh, I thought they were great after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, but now I really question whether or not they have the military capabilities. I think we've really reversed that narrative. On the China Indo-Pacific front, and this is actually, it's really interesting to hear these arguments because I view it in a totally different way, where I actually view this as demonstrating precisely why we needed to confront the Iranian threat now before waiting for a situation where we were also confronting China. I agree we're not adequately resourced to confront both at the same time, and I'm very grateful that right now, people like Rebeccah and others are fighting really hard and have been for years, well before Epic Fury, to make sure that we are better resourced. But when I think about, the Strait of Hormuz question, once again, first of all, this isn't a new risk. In 2019, the Iranians also tried to exercise economic coercion in the Strait of Hormuz. They attacked tankers and cargo ships, and we were able to create a coalition of countries that was able to stop it. And then what did the Iranians do? They realized that they had a better ability to default to their military capabilities. They knew that military coercion was more powerful than the economic coercion, so they defaulted to that. They can't default to that anymore because we've taken out those capabilities. And the good news about the Strait of Hormuz is that we know that there are alternatives. We're already seeing Saudi Arabia reinvigorating the East-West pipeline for 7 million barrels of oil per day. We know that just prior to October 7th, there was the announcement of the India-Middle East corridor to try to replace this too. So what we're realizing is we're taking away the long-term ability for Iran to exercise precisely the kind of economic coercion that, if we were in a confrontation with China, would significantly harm our allies, specifically those that are dependent on the Strait of Hormuz for their oil, like South Korea, like Japan, like Taiwan. So we've actually gotten ahead of the crisis. And so that's why, again, I think that ultimately this is in the best sort of net national security interests of the United States, including because I agree that China is the more significant threat than Iran.
I think Jason was trying to jump in, and we don't have to follow the exact order all the way through, but jump in and interrupt and yell at each other or whatever. But it looks like Jason was trying to do that.
Well, I was just going to mention that Pedro Sanchez hosting our great ally Delcy Rodriguez may be a point in his favor.
Not 2019,
But no, I mean, because Elbridge Colby is muzzled on Twitter now, being in the administration, I'm going to do my best impression, in part on some of these Asia points. I mean, I just think us showing a willingness to maul a weak and non-nuclear state doesn't really tell people very much about our willingness to take on more powerful countries in the war. And I just think the munitions point that Chris was making, we don't know yet. These numbers are classified, but I think once it's over and it's tallied, it's going to be quite ghastly. Once we see how deeply we went into our inventories. I mean, the Post reported 850 Tomahawk missiles used. That's a quarter estimated of our total supply. Maybe 1,000 of those JASSMs shot. Lockheed is going to produce 396 this year. We're talking about years. Multiple years, 40% of THAAD interceptors in just a couple weeks.
I've also got Post reporting here, though, also, and it is because of this war that this president is finally doing what President Biden should have done when Russia invaded Ukraine. So we are now finally going to get the budget to 5% of GDP, which is exactly what we've asked our NATO allies to do. And so now we're going to be able to not only replenish our stocks that we've used in this war, but we're going to actually increase our capacity to produce weapons at the scale necessary to handle a variety of threats and to be able to get our foreign military sales out the door. We have a China problem, a Russia problem, an Iran problem, a North Korea problem, and narco-terrorist states that are proxies for those countries in our own hemisphere. So we have had this problem for a long time. As is often the case, it takes the United States having to use them to be able to be finally motivated to invest in our defense industrial base to get it where we need to be to handle the variety of threats that we have, and we're doing it. So yes, I agree with you. We have used significant numbers of missile defense interceptors, significant numbers of Tomahawk missiles, but we've used them wisely on a power that deserved them. And now we've taken the Iran problem, at least significantly degraded it so that, and by the way, Iran was China's, if not proxy, exactly, pretty close to it in the Middle East. And it was a significant power that enabled Russia's war in Ukraine, also on its back heel. So both of those files, I think, have the ability to be much more manageable now with a significantly weakened Iran.
I just think we're always saying that we're going to do this after we solve one more problem. We're going to focus on our greatest threat, and we'll see if that's the case. I certainly hope it's the case, but that's not been the record over the last 3 or so administrations that have been saying so about China. Just quickly, I would say a difference between China and Russia is that we want to stop China from seizing Taiwan, stop it from seizing islands owned by the Philippines, Japan, et cetera. We want to stop Russia from expanding into NATO. We have a defined objective of what we want to deny. With Iran, if our goal is just to keep them weak, that's something that we're going to keep needing to go back to over and over and over again. So, those weapons will keep getting used.
I mean, I think on the defense budget, it's interesting, Rebeccah. I mean, regardless of whether you think we should be at 3%, 4%, 5%, 10%, whatever, but that predates the war. So in the terms of our debate right now, I mean, the administration's plan to go up to $1.5 trillion or whatever the latest figure is, obviously is before the war. So I don't think we can count that on the ledger of things that improved or harmed, if you think, U.S. national
It finally
security.
motivated the administration to do what we should have done and gets us in a safer position.
That predates the beginning of this war. But in any event, I wanted to make a larger point because the question about Iran's relation with Russia is one that I've been thinking about a lot. I've written a lot about this over the course of the last few years. I mean, and it is true that to some degree damaging Iran hurts Russia a little bit. But my point again is that on the whole, this war has been just a gigantic boon to Russia. I mean, just imagine the amount of money that is just flowing into Putin's war machine as a consequence of the higher oil prices and the lifting of U.S. sanctions. And another thing that is true both for Russia and for China, we've seen this come out in the Post and in other places, is that Russia has actually tightened its cooperation with Iran as a consequence of this war. China, we've also seen reports, is planning on, if it has not already, tightened its cooperation with Iran as a consequence of this war. Now, to me, that's really bad for U.S. national security. What we want to see is to see Iran, China, and Russia all grow further apart. But in this case, what we've done is actually to push them much closer together and onto an operational level that starts to become, an even more serious concern for U.S. national security.
Do you all want to respond to the
Well,
Russia-China point?
Well, I find it's so interesting that I find some of the arguments against what we're doing now were exactly the same arguments that people who supported the United States supporting Iran were using, or supporting Ukraine were using, that if the United States supported Ukraine, that we would push Russia and China together. All of these countries are working together because they have shared interests to undermine the United States and to undermine our alliance architectures. That has been true for the last, it's been getting worse for the last couple of decades, but predates that. So I don't see the United States acting in our interest as the cause for our adversaries then working closer together in order to undermine the United States.
Plenty of evidence for it in the New York Times and in the Washington Post and many other sources. The question is not whether or not...
Well, let's stick to sightings in the Post. I like it when you guys did that.
Economist, whatever the radio station was that you worked at.
Yeah, that one, I don't know.
We're arguing about what the effect of this war is, okay? So I'm trying to point to the specific ways in which this particular war has strengthened relations between Iran and Russia and China and Iran. And there's plenty of reporting on that.
But I just want to say, but our support for Ukraine arguably also made that China support Russia in new ways that they were not doing before. That does not negate the rightness of the United States supplying arms to Ukraine or helping Ukraine. So I don't think that's a very compelling argument for why the United States should not act in our interest to diminish a foe or to strengthen our allies. The other thing I will just say that I do think is an unexpected outcome that's good for the United States and our allies is I think Ukraine looks really good right now. Ukraine is a very useful and competent European country supplying drone defense and the ability to counter drones to our Arab partners. I think that Ukraine is politically scoring pretty big in this war.
Just on the proxy war point, if we're making the analogy of the U.S. war in Iran and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are more like Russia in that we are the stronger power that's attacking the weaker power based on sort of a preemptive self-defense idea that says nothing about the morality. These countries are not comparable, but it's not going well for Russia. They're getting bogged down there because once you start a war against a smaller country and you end up in a great power proxy conflict, that's how we ended up in Vietnam. You don't really want to be the one trying to subdue the weaker country that's getting aid from your great power rivals. It's going badly for Russia. It might go similarly in Iran, as Russia ships them weapons over the Caspian Sea, as China starts to rebuild their air defenses. We don't want to get in a situation where we're getting bled by our proxies. They're sitting pretty if they can just ship some stuff to Iran and force us to burn through all of our munitions.
The obvious difference, of course, is that, Iran did actively threaten the United States, actively referred to us as the Great Satan, actively was lying to us about their nuclear program, their ballistic missiles program. They were actively killing Americans, including, Iranian drones that were using Russian tactics that killed our 3 service members in Jordan. So they were actually antagonizing the United States in a way that Ukraine obviously was not antagonizing Russia. The other thing that I would argue is that at the end of the day, even if you were to buy the argument that they've created a closer alliance, which I would dispute that there's a closer alliance between Iran and China or Iran and Russia now than before, but Iran is so significantly weakened that relationship is no longer one that benefits China. It's no longer one that benefits Russia. Russia was depending on Iranian drones for years, and now those drone factories have been destroyed by the United States. That is a benefit to Ukraine and to the United States. So ultimately, and again, I just go back to, I want to prevent a long-term conflict with China. I think many people, that is the number one threat. And right now, if we are able to create an economic situation where we and our allies are no longer dependent on the Strait of Hormuz because we're pursuing these other alternatives that we know are already being pursued, and China is the one that's most dependent on the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran is the one that's most dependent on that being used. If we could find alternatives, then we are much more capable of confronting China over the long run. That's, again, why even though we're both looking at the China question differently, I put it on the ledger of this actually, in the long term, helps us in countering China because it removes one of their core proxies that was doing their bidding in the Middle East and around the world.
Can I ask, now we're halfway through a 2-week ceasefire. Perhaps it will be extended, perhaps it will end. But both sides are beginning to talk to each other. They didn't go very well over the weekend. I think the vice president said it's not good for Iran, or it's not good for the U.S. It's really not good for Iran. But I'm curious, when you all look at the ledger of pro and con from this conflict, could you see yourself shifting to the other side of this debate, depending how negotiations go, and something that could realistically come out of these? I think if there was permanent, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization and they held free elections, you all might say, okay, all right, this was a decent conflict to wage, and if we had decided that we would join, the axis of resistance as the United States, maybe you all would think that this didn't go well. But when we think about things that could actually happen, that we think realistically could happen, are there things you're worried about, or things that you would be hoping for, even though you may not think are likely to happen? I'm curious how you all think about the negotiations and the matrix of possibilities that the U.S. and Iran are looking at when they sit across from each other at the table.
I mean, look, I believe strongly in the path of negotiations. I'm glad that we are doing that. I'm glad that Vice President Vance went there. I'm thankful to the Pakistanis for helping to organize this. I think this is the way to go. I do not think that certainly the way things look today, and it's very hard to see because this is changing and everything evolves, but the way things look today, it does not look like we're going to get an agreement that in any way, shape, or form resembles the agreements that both the first Trump and the Biden administration tried to get out of Iran. An agreement, in other words, that's comprehensive, that includes conventional capabilities, Iran's relationship with its proxies. We probably, hopefully, will get something on the nuclear front, and we'll also have to get the Iranians to make some kind of a pledge on the Strait of Hormuz and try to remove, to some degree, their ability to weaponize it, but that's going to be very hard to do. So that's, for me, that's sort of the maximum that we're going to get right now. In other words, we're not going to be in any better shape in terms of our relationship with Iran or the world's relationship with Iran or the threat that Iran poses than we were under the JCPOA. And that's the irony of this whole thing, is that after all of this, we probably will end up back where we were in 2017 when the Trump administration withdrew.
I would just add on the JCPOA, I'm probably one of the few people who thought the JCPOA was bad and also think that this war is bad. And it's in part because I bought the line that the alternative to the JCPOA is not a war. But maybe that was not true, and that was just something that people sold to oppose the JCPOA. But I do actually think a tougher agreement ought to be possible. I'm not sure how reliable Iran is in terms of anything that they sign coming out of these negotiations. So as long as their regime is still in place and able to reconstitute its military and having demonstrated its control, ability to threaten shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, that wouldn't change my opinion. But if the regime changes, then I would start to say, okay, now we've eliminated a long-term threat that does enable us to focus on other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree on the JCPOA point only because, I mean, obviously my criticism, like many criticism of the JCPOA, was that it ultimately did allow a pathway for Iran to legally develop a nuclear weapon. That was the number one concern. Within a month, they had already violated some of their agreements in terms of production of heavy water. We saw that they had undeclared sites that they were not providing access to for the IAEA. So I don't think that was a good practice, because it meant as the sunset clauses and provisions came into effect, then ultimately Iran would have the legal right to a nuclear weapon and ballistic missile capabilities to deliver it. So I do think we're in a much better position than the JCPOA in 2015, because ultimately now they don't have the ballistic missile capabilities, which I said we were able to pull down by about 90%, and they don't have the nuclear capabilities that they once had, particularly because we were able to, in Midnight Hammer, address all of those points in the production chain. In terms of the question, though, of would anything change my mind, I mean, I will say, I think it's very important that these alternative routes to the Strait of Hormuz do get pursued. That's not going to necessarily be something that happens in the negotiation between us and the Iranians, but making sure that we do develop the, the India-Middle East corridor, making sure that we do, that Saudi does continue to use their East-West pipeline, because these are the things that over the long term, if everybody's overly reliant on the Strait of Hormuz, it's just a huge geostrategic choke point for us and our allies. So that's something that will be very important in the final calculus, that we ensure that we're not dependent on Iran's economic coercion there.
The other thing I would say too, because I lived through the JCPOA fight, and it wasn't just that it wasn't Iran deal or war. It was really, when you flesh it out, it was Iran deal or catastrophic war we would lose. That was sort of when you flesh it out and you just start debating. Like, it was, if you talk to these people who were very defensive of the JCPOA, it was oh my goodness, they would take out our carrier if we got near there. Iran's ballistic missile force would be able to do X, Y, and Z throughout their. It was almost like Iran was so strong that we simply had to live with a latent nuclear capability and simply deal with it. And in the meantime, if you just judge the JCPOA by what the Obama administration say they originally wanted, they wanted to get to the bottom of the possible military dimensions of the program. They never did. They wanted anytime, anywhere inspections, which they didn't get. They wanted to handle the terrorism problem, which they didn't include. They wanted to include the ballistic missile program, which it was the Russians that came in at the last minute and made sure that ballistic missiles were not included in the JCPOA. And then you had sunset provisions. So the JCPOA was a good college effort at dealing with the Iran problem through diplomacy, and it failed. And when that fails, in order to bolster the credibility of American military strength, which is also always what makes diplomacy work. Diplomacy works when you have a credible threat of military force that you're willing to use. The United States has had a bipartisan to almost frozen in indecision and risk aversion, to the point where we have simply just said we have to accept these threats that we are actually militarily superior over and do have the ability to affect. So I think we finally got to the point where we said enough. And then now we've demonstrated, as Carrie said, not just a military capability, but an incredible military competency, which I do think has the effect of boosting our deterrent, signaling that we have in other regions of the world. In terms of, I just want to answer it quickly. This is a really great question. I think if we come out of this where, because I do believe that we are in the driver's seat on this. We have not moved a single force out of the region. We actually flowed more forces in to the region during this ceasefire. We now are opening the strait and have established a corridor there. We do have the Europeans that are getting together. I'm constantly assured by the French and the Brits that they are putting together an international armada. We have so many things going our way. I think it would be an absolute catastrophe and disaster if the United States just simply said, fine, Iran can control the strait and do some sort of toll booth thing with the Chinese or whatever they do. 90% of Iranian oil that comes out of there goes to China. So I think if we let Iran essentially control the strait, we've just ceded that to China completely unnecessarily when there's no need to do it. And the last thing I say, I do believe that our transatlantic alliance is critical, and now should be a moment where both sides of the Atlantic reassess and get back to repairing those relationships, because clearly we do need each other.
Sorry, go ahead, Jess.
I would just say quickly, after the JCPOA, I supported it again. Trump pulling out of it, maximum pressure. Iran proved to be deterrable. When we killed Soleimani, they stopped the terrorist attacks in Iraq. After Midnight Hammer, there was no effort that we saw to lunge for a nuclear weapon. So we had the ability to deter them, and I think they were deterrable. But now we tried to annihilate their senior leadership. So now deterrence, getting back to deterrence, is a much heavier lift. Go ahead, Greg.
I wanted to respond to Rebeccah's point on deterrence, especially with regard to Taiwan, because this is an important point that she's making here. And I've gone back and forth on whether or not we should count better deterrence for Taiwan as a net positive outcome from this war. Because it is true that we've demonstrated the extraordinary military capability of the United States. That's without question. But the thing is, as I thought about it, China basically already knew that. But what they've learned from this is about the credibility of our commitment. And what they've seen is, first of all, that actually the Indo-Pacific, despite what we say, is not our main priority, that we're willing to suck all kinds of critical munitions out of it in order to fight more wars in the Middle East. But at the same time, they've also seen that, American politics is kind of shaky and weak. I mean, we got kind of a glass jaw, right? Things start to get going a little bit tough economically, and suddenly we say, we got to negotiate, we got to negotiate, we got to negotiate. And that's a lesson that I think President Xi is going to take to the bank when he thinks about what the right time is to go after Taiwan.
Now we're down to just our final 7 or 8 minutes here, so I wanted to give everyone a chance, just some closing thoughts, and maybe one way to frame it is, what has been the biggest lesson of this conflict? Something that has changed how you've thought over the past 50 or so days, or so far, and it may not be over yet. What is the biggest takeaway, or the thing that people who think about foreign policy or American national security should have learned from the past 6 weeks or so? Whoever wants to go first.
I mean,
Maybe I should have given you guys a heads up. I was going to end on this, but I thought of it just a second ago. It's a pretty good idea.
I mean, about President Trump, I don't think he thinks, strategically in the way that some of us in DC do, which is sometimes a benefit and sometimes damaging. I think his thinking on this was more, I lost my tariff powers, which enabled me to dominate the world economy with a stray tweet. Venezuela went really well. I was talking about invading Greenland, but the markets responded really badly to that. So without much public explanation, here's sort of an opportunity. And this is how, so it's a president, I think, doing foreign policy in a way that, DC is obsessed with the policy-making process and so on. And again, that's not been perfect either. But I think that this is going to make people have concerns about the imperial presidency, about a president, bringing an armada around the world, trying to depose governments without congressional authorization. So as sort of a constitutionalist, someone who considers himself both basically believes in a strong military and is also a constitutionalist, that's been troubling. And I guess I thought, it's given the people on the new right, or whatever you want to call it, turn out to have less sway over Trump than they might have thought. But I do think it just shows that America has trouble focusing, and we're fighting another war in the Middle East, which is and I think the political consequences of this, both on the left and the right. I think maybe on the left it makes it harder to get consensus on things like the NDAA or on appropriations. I think on the right you might have people say, hey, I voted for Trump for no new wars. I voted for Bush, and I voted for Trump for no new wars. We get a war in the Middle East every time. So I think the trajectory and the aftershocks politically, domestically, gave us Obama and Trump of the Iraq War. So I think we're going to see political aftershocks for a long time, not super salutary, unless we have some sort of decisive victory that, to me, does not look particularly within reach.
Yeah, I would say, first, I do think it's right to be really judicious about the use of force. And if we are going to use force, I think there needs to be a very clear reason why we're using it. In this case, for the reasons that Rebeccah and I articulated, I think I very much support the use of force here, and think that we've taken out a significant adversary and a significant proxy of an even more significant adversary. I think what has probably surprised me is it's been a truism for a long time that DC is often fighting the last war we have rather than the future war. And I think I've been surprised by how true that is. The comparisons to Iraq are completely understandable. It's another war in the Middle East. However, again, if we are able to take out our core leading adversaries' major proxy that could weigh us down in two conflicts at the same time, if we can take them out before we have to actually confront that major adversary, I think it gives us a significant advantage. And so for me, I'm looking at that future. God forbid we end up in a future war with China, but at least now, if we do, we have taken out one of their major proxies in the Middle East, we've taken out one of their major proxies in Latin America, and we now have much more freedom of navigation to ensure that we can focus directly on that threat, which is what we're seeing in terms of how this administration is now thinking about rebuilding our defense industrial base.
Chris.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, obviously, I think this war is a mistake and a costly one. I mean, it hasn't achieved a whole lot, has achieved some things, but not a whole lot. The best case, as I said earlier, about where we're going to be is a JCPOA-like agreement. In the meantime, we've strengthened our adversaries and isolated ourselves from our allies. I mean, I think the sort of strategy here, there's a broader point about the strategy that underlies this approach to Iran, which is a strategy that believes that military and economic coercion can force other countries to bend to our will and get us whatever we want, even when doing so violates their vital national interests. And this is a simplistic kind of statecraft that we saw. It didn't work with North Korea in the first Trump administration. It didn't work when last year in April with the effort to try and use economic measures to coerce China to do what we wanted. We had to back off. We've tried it with Russia over the course of the last year and actually also with the Biden administration. It also didn't work there. Now we're trying this method with Iran, and it's not going to work this time either.
Yeah, I would just say a couple of points. One, this war is only about 5 weeks, 6 weeks old. So, right. So we're debating sort of how this is going to work in the end. And so it's kind of amazing just to kind of step back and realize how much we have accomplished. And this is a very, very short conflict thus far. So that's the first point. But in terms of things that really stick out in my mind that we should really take to heart and really appreciate and learn as national security professionals is one, ideology matters. Ideology matters when we're thinking about the risk of a regime. I think that we have really gotten to the point where we have thought about these different schools of realism, and we have kind of been lured into thinking that maybe it's not so much ideology, and to be more realist, we discount that. I think it's just so obviously false that part of what drove the United States to make the decision to do this was the fact that the Iranians were not chastened after Midnight Hammer and slaughtered at 35,000 to almost 45,000 of Iranian protesters. And so I think it's really important that we consider that was an important piece in the decision-making of the U.S. to say, we cannot allow a regime so determined to hold on to the Islamic Revolution like this, that it would slaughter its own people, that to have a nuclear weapon and to coerce the global economy. And so ideology matters greatly, and it should affect how the United States thinks about its partners and allies. And then the other big point that I think that we should really kind of think about and digest is the United States is much stronger than we thought we were. We spend so much time looking at the incredible military capabilities of the Chinese Communist Party, of the Russian Federation. They've got significant nuclear programs. China's in the midst of a massive nuclear breakout. We hear about this a lot, about the size of the Navy, their production capacity, but we have watched the Chinese air defense systems do nothing in Venezuela, do nothing in Iran. I mean, we jokingly call them the Timu weapon systems. Now, part of it is user error, and I understand all of that. But it is incredible, the stealth capabilities that the United States possesses that China does not, and our military competency across the joint force. That should give us a lot of confidence, I think, as we deal with a variety of different threats, even after this one.
Great. Well, this has been a fascinating, illuminating conversation. So thank you all for participating. Really appreciate it. And thank you all for coming out. Let's give a round of applause to be involved. Yeah. And no one changed their mind, right? No one wants to do this. Okay, well, it's still very educational. So thanks so much.